In a quiet Idaho town, a teenage girl's ordinary night turned into a real-life horror movie, scripted not by Hollywood, but by her own classmates. What drove two 16-year-olds to plan, film, and execute one of the most chilling murders in modern America? The truth is more terrifying than fiction. In the quiet town of Pocatello, Idaho, the autumn of 2006 carried a calmness typical of small American communities. It was the kind of place where people left their doors unlocked, where neighbors knew each other by name, and where teenagers gathered after school at local diners, unaware of the darkness that could exist in familiar faces. Among these teenagers was Cassie Jo Stoddard, a 16-year-old high school junior known for her warm smile and quiet sense of responsibility. Cassie wasn't the type to draw attention. She was modest, artistic, and thoughtful, the kind of student teachers admired and classmates trusted. Her friends described her as reliable and mature beyond her years, someone who avoided drama and always tried to do the right thing. That same maturity led her to take on small jobs, one of which would tragically place her in the wrong house at the wrong time. In late September, Cassie agreed to house sit for her aunt and uncle, Allison and Frank Contreras, while they were out of town for the weekend. Their home sat on Whispering Cliffs Drive, a semi-isolated area just outside Pocatello, a quiet, safe neighborhood overlooking a stretch of rolling hills. For Cassie, this was not just a simple responsibility. It was an opportunity to prove herself trustworthy, dependable, and capable. She looked forward to spending a few nights in the spacious home, watching over the pets, and enjoying a weekend of quiet independence. To make the night less lonely, she invited her boyfriend, Matt Beckham, to join her after school on Friday, September 22, 2006. Matt was an easygoing teenager, gentle and kind, with an affection for Cassie that was genuine and obvious to everyone around them. Their evening plans were simple: watch a movie, relax, and keep each other company. As night settled over Pocatello, Cassie and Matt sat together in the living room, the flickering light of a movie filling the otherwise quiet house. At around 8 p.m., two familiar faces appeared at the door: Brian Draper and Tori Adamczyk, both 16, classmates of Cassie and Matt at Pocatello High School. They had called earlier to ask what the two were up to, and Cassie had told them she was house-sitting. The boys asked if they could stop by and hang out for a while. Cassie didn't think twice. She knew them from school, and while they weren't close friends, they were part of the same circle. They arrived carrying an air of casual teenage energy, laughing and joking as they entered the house. The group settled in to watch a movie, the 2001 film Kill Bill Volume 2. For a while, everything felt normal. They ate snacks, talked about school, and teased each other as teenagers do. What Cassie didn't know was that Brian and Tori had arrived with a far darker intention. For weeks, they had been consumed by a shared obsession: horror films, serial killers, and the fantasy of committing what they called a real-life murder. Inspired by the movie Scream, they had started filming themselves on a camcorder, documenting their thoughts and plans as if they were creating their own twisted documentary. They fantasized about becoming infamous, about recording every step of a perfect crime. In their secret recordings, they spoke about wanting to kill someone they knew, someone who trusted them. That night, they had already chosen their victim: Cassie Jo Stoddard. After about an hour, Brian and Tori told Cassie and Matt they had to leave to go watch a movie at the cinema. They said their goodbyes and walked out into the night. But instead of going to the theater, they parked nearby, opened the trunk of their car, and pulled out dark clothing, gloves, and knives. They put on black masks, homemade, roughly cut, eerily resembling something out of a slasher movie, and returned to the Contreras property on foot. Slipping into the basement through an unlocked door, they began cutting the power to the house, intending to frighten Cassie before striking. Upstairs, Cassie and Matt noticed the lights flicker and go out. The pets began to act uneasy. At first, they thought it was just a blown fuse. The house sat on a rural hill. Power issues weren't unheard of. Matt tried to reassure Cassie, though she was visibly tense. He called his mother, asking if he could stay the night with Cassie, but she refused, saying it wouldn't be appropriate. Reluctantly, Matt promised Cassie he'd call her later to make sure she was okay. Around 10:30 p.m., He left the house. Cassie locked the doors behind him, unaware that two of her classmates were still lurking in the basement below. Brian and Tori waited until the sound of Matt's car faded into the distance before making their move. They cut the power again and began making noises, slamming doors, rustling objects, trying to lure Cassie toward the basement. But Cassie, frightened, stayed upstairs. Growing impatient, they crept up the staircase, dressed in black, masks over their faces, knives drawn. What happened next was both chaotic and cruel. Cassie likely heard them before she saw them, perhaps thinking someone had broken in. When the boys revealed themselves, she must have been terrified, realizing too late that the figures standing before her were not strangers, but people she knew, people she had led into the house earlier that evening. They attacked her with relentless ferocity. Cassie was stabbed over 30 times. 12 of those wounds were fatal. She tried to fight back, her hands bearing defensive wounds, but she was overpowered. When it was over, Brian and Tori left her lying on the living room floor, bleeding and alone in the dark. The next 2 days would bring unbearable discovery. When Cassie's aunt and uncle returned home on Sunday, September 24th, they found her lifeless body where she had fallen. The scene was horrifying. Blood spattered across the carpet, signs of struggle everywhere. Cassie's family and friends were devastated. News of her death spread quickly through Pocatello High School, leaving students in disbelief. A 16-year-old girl, murdered in the safety of her relative's home. It seemed impossible. Police began their investigation immediately, focusing on those who had last seen her alive. It didn't take long for two names to surface repeatedly: Brian Draper and Tori Adamczyk. When questioned, both boys claimed they had left the house early and spent the rest of the evening at a movie. But investigators were skeptical. Their stories didn't align perfectly, and both seemed nervous. In the days that followed, detectives began piecing together inconsistencies. They obtained search warrants, looked into their belongings, and soon uncovered something that would shatter the community's sense of safety forever: videotapes recorded by the boys themselves. Those tapes contained chilling footage of Brian and Tori plotting Cassie's murder in detail, days before it happened. In one clip, they talked about their plan, laughing, referencing horror films, and declaring their intention to kill someone for fun. Another clip, recorded hours before the murder, showed them driving around, referring to Cassie by name, describing her as their chosen victim. It was the smoking gun, and the proof of pure, premeditated evil hiding behind two teenage faces. What began as an ordinary night for a responsible young girl had turned into a nightmare inspired by fantasy and driven by delusion. And as investigators soon realized, this crime wasn't spontaneous. It was carefully scripted, a deadly performance that two boys had convinced themselves would make them legends. The discovery of Cassie Jo Stoddart's body shattered the illusion of safety in Pocatello. Word of her murder spread rapidly through the small community, turning whispers into disbelief and disbelief into anger. Teachers, classmates, and neighbors were paralyzed by the same haunting question: who could have done such a thing to a girl like Cassie? Detectives with the Bannock County Sheriff's Office began their work immediately, starting with interviews of everyone who had seen Cassie in her final hours. Her boyfriend, Matt Beckham, was the first person called in. He sat across from the investigators, distraught and shaking, replaying the events of that night again and again. Matt explained that he had been with Cassie for most of the evening, watching a movie, and that their friends Brian Draper and Tori Adamczyk had stopped by before leaving to see a film at the theater. He mentioned how scared Cassie had been when the lights went out and how guilty he felt for leaving her alone. His story was consistent and filled with emotion. The story of a teenage boy crushed by something he couldn't have predicted. Detectives believed him. Their focus quickly shifted to the other two names that kept resurfacing: Brian Draper and Tori Adamczyk. On the surface, both appeared to be typical high school boys. Brian was a bit quiet and socially awkward, fascinated by dark topics and history, often mentioning his admiration for the Columbine shooters, which had unsettled some classmates. Tori, in contrast, was more outgoing, involved in school activities, and seen as friendly and creative. The two had bonded over their love for horror movies, filmmaking, and a shared sense of alienation. They dreamed of becoming famous directors, inspired by Quentin Tarantino and Wes Craven, but beneath their fascination with movies lay something deeply distorted. Their friendship fed a growing obsession, the idea of recording real violence, of blurring the line between fiction and reality. When detectives brought the boys in for questioning, both seemed nervous but tried to maintain composure. Brian spoke softly, giving short answers. Tori was more controlled, insisting that they had gone to the movie theater after leaving Cassie's house and stayed there all night. The detectives pressed them about what film they had seen. Tori hesitated before naming Pulse, a horror movie that happened to be playing in town that evening. When asked for ticket stubs, they couldn't provide any. Their vague answers raised suspicion, but there was still no solid evidence tying them to the murder. Investigators obtained search warrants for both boys' homes. Inside Brian's house, they discovered a small collection of knives, masks, and dark clothing. Items that could easily be dismissed as part of a teenager's fascination with horror, but taken together, they hinted at something more sinister. Then, in Tori's possession, they uncovered something far more disturbing, a videotape. When detectives played it, what unfolded before their eyes was chilling beyond words. The footage showed Brian and Tori in a car, days before Cassie's murder, laughing, whispering, and speaking directly into the camera. They spoke casually about their plan to kill someone. "We're going to kill Cassie Jo Stoddart," Brian's voice said, calm and deliberate. "We're doing it for fun." Tori nodded in agreement, grinning, adding that they wanted to make history. They discussed how they would commit the crime, where it would happen, and even their fear of getting caught. To them, this wasn't reality, it was a film in progress. They referred to it as their project, as though Cassie's life was just a scene waiting to be shot. The more police watched, the clearer it became that this wasn't spontaneous violence. It was premeditated, rehearsed, and documented with the arrogance of teenagers who believed they were untouchable. Another clip, recorded the afternoon before the murder, showed them driving through town, giddy with anticipation. Brian's voice was excited as he said, "We're going to do it tonight." Tori laughed in agreement. These recordings were devastating evidence, proof of planning, intent, and utter lack of empathy. When confronted with the tapes, Brian broke first. The facade cracked, and in the sterile light of the interrogation room, his voice trembled as he began to confess. He admitted that he and Tori had planned the murder, inspired by the movie Scream and their obsession with creating their own horror story. He described how they had worn dark clothing, entered through the basement, and cut the power to frighten Cassie. According to Brian, he had stabbed her first, and Tori had joined in. But he tried to shift the greater blame to Tori, claiming that he only went along because he was afraid of losing his friend. Tori, when shown the same evidence, denied everything. He claimed that the tapes were just jokes, scripted nonsense meant to mimic the kind of horror films they loved. He said they had gone to the theater and later returned home, never going back to Cassie's house. But the physical evidence told a different story. Investigators found traces of blood matching Cassie's DNA on a knife recovered from a wooded area where Brian had led police after his confession. They also found a pair of gloves and clothing items that linked directly to both boys. As news of their arrests broke, Pocatello's sense of disbelief turned to outrage. Parents struggled to comprehend how two ordinary teenagers could commit such a brutal act. Teachers recalled seeing the boys joking in class, never imagining they were capable of violence. Cassie's classmates mourned with confusion and fear, wondering if they could have seen signs and missed them. The case soon drew national attention. Media outlets portrayed it as a horrifying blend of teenage fantasy and real-life tragedy. A murder born from obsession with movies, fame, and the thrill of death. Commentators questioned the influence of media violence on young minds, while psychologists described the boys' actions as a result of narcissism and detachment from empathy. Yet even among those explanations, one fact remained incomprehensible. Cassie's murder was deliberate. She was chosen because she was kind, trusting, and accessible. The prosecutors prepared for trial, armed with overwhelming evidence. The videotapes were central to the case, showing motive, planning, and even confession-like statements. Both boys would be tried as adults despite being 16 at the time of the crime. Each was charged with first-degree murder and conspiracy to commit murder. Their friendship, once built on shared dreams of filmmaking, would now turn into mutual betrayal as both tried to minimize their own responsibility. Brian Draper's defense centered on the claim that he had been influenced by Tori, that his fascination with violence had been fed by Tori's encouragement. He painted himself as an impressionable follower. Tori Adamczyk's defense countered by portraying Brian as the manipulative one, the instigator who pushed the idea too far. Each wanted to escape the shadow of the other, but the evidence bound them together. During pretrial hearings, the public was given a glimpse into their chilling world through excerpts of the tapes. One recording, played in court, silenced the room. In it, after Cassie's death, Brian's voice could be heard saying, "I just killed Cassie Jo Stoddart. I feel great." Tori could be heard laughing in the background. It was undeniable. They weren't forced. They weren't coerced. They were proud. For Cassie's family, the days that followed were unbearable. They attended hearings, holding hands, listening as their daughter's last moments were described in excruciating detail. Cassie's mother wept openly, unable to comprehend how her daughter's kindness had been met with such cruelty. Her aunt, whose home had become the scene of the crime, struggled with guilt for years afterward. Every corner of that house was now haunted by the memory of what Cassie had endured. By early 2007, the stage was set for one of Idaho's most disturbing trials. The prosecution promised to expose not only what the boys had done but the disturbing mindset that had led them there. A mindset rooted in fantasy, cruelty, and the belief that murder could make them famous. The courtroom would soon become a theater of truth, where every lie they had told, every video they had made, and every dark thought they had recorded would be played for the world to see. The trial of Brian Draper and Tori Adamczyk began in 2007 inside the Bannock County Courthouse, drawing crowds of journalists, students, and parents who still couldn't understand how two ordinary high school boys could have committed a murder so brutal. The courtroom was tense from the start. The faces of the accused looked young, almost innocent, but the evidence waiting to be presented told a far darker story. At the heart of the prosecution's case were the videotapes, those eerie home recordings where the boys had filmed themselves plotting Cassie Jo Stoddart's murder as though they were writing a movie script. The tapes captured their laughter, their excitement, their cold planning. Every frame was a portrait of calculated cruelty. Prosecutor James Thomas told the jury that the boys had treated Cassie's life like entertainment, reducing her to a character in their fantasy. They planned it, they practiced it, and they filmed it, he said. And then they carried it out with no mercy. Cassie's family sat in the front row each day, enduring the unimaginable. Her mother wiped tears as the prosecution described how Cassie had been attacked in her aunt and uncle's home, a place she had considered safe. Photographs of the crime scene were shown. The blood-stained carpet, the overturned furniture, the signs of her desperate struggle. The jury saw the masks the boys had worn, the knives they carried, and the gloves they discarded. But what left the greatest impact were the words spoken by the defendants themselves, recorded on those tapes. In one chilling clip played for the courtroom, Brian's voice could be heard saying, "We're going to go down in history." Tori's laughter followed. The jurors shifted uneasily in their seats. It wasn't just evidence. It was the sound of two boys glorifying murder. Brian Draper's defense team tried to portray him as a misguided follower, a boy fascinated with darkness but pressured into violence by Tori. They brought up his background, his religious upbringing, his history of depression, his social awkwardness, and painted him as easily manipulated. Tori's defense countered by shifting the blame back, arguing that Brian had been the real mastermind, the one obsessed with horror films and serial killers. They emphasized Tori's academic record, his involvement in extracurricular activities, his seemingly normal life. But every time a recording played, those arguments fell apart. In those moments, both boys sounded equally enthusiastic, equally complicit. They were partners in the crime from beginning to end. Witnesses took the stand, classmates, teachers, investigators. Matt Beckham, Cassie's boyfriend, testified with visible pain, describing the last time he saw her alive and the guilt that had haunted him ever since. He told the jury about the power going out, Cassie's growing fear, and his helplessness when he left her alone. Investigators explained how the evidence linked the boys to the crime. The matching knife marks, the recovered weapons, and the DNA found on a glove buried near a field. Every new detail added another layer of horror to an already devastating case. The defense team struggled to humanize their clients, calling psychologists who suggested that both boys had been influenced by violent media and youthful immaturity. But the prosecution reminded the court that Cassie had been stabbed over 30 times, 12 of those wounds fatal, and that the attack had been planned for weeks. This was not a sudden outburst or accident. It was murder by design, carried out by teenagers who knew exactly what they were doing. When the prosecution played the final tape, recorded just after Cassie's death, the courtroom fell silent. Brian's voice, trembling with adrenaline, declared, "I just killed Cassie Jo Stoddard. I feel great." Tori could be heard agreeing, laughing nervously. The video ended with both of them discussing how to hide the evidence. The jurors' faces told the story: shock, revulsion, and disbelief. After weeks of testimony, the time came for closing arguments. The prosecution's words were direct and powerful. "Cassie Jo Stoddard trusted these boys," the prosecutor said, pointing toward Brian and Tori. "She let them into the house. She offered them kindness. And they rewarded her trust with unimaginable cruelty. They wanted to be remembered, and now they will be as killers." The defense, knowing the mountain of evidence, asked the jury for mercy, urging them to consider the boys' youth. But the community had already made up its mind. Justice for Cassie had become a shared cry throughout Pocatello. When the jury returned with its verdict, the courtroom was silent except for the sound of the clerk reading the decision. Both Brian Draper and Tori Adamczyk were found guilty of first-degree murder and conspiracy to commit murder. Cassie's mother wept openly, clutching a photo of her daughter. The boys sat motionless, the reality of what they had done finally settling in. Later, at sentencing, the judge's words carried the weight of the community's grief. "You took an innocent life for no reason," he said. "You showed no remorse. You will spend the rest of your lives in prison." Both were sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. In the years that followed, both boys appealed their sentences, arguing that their life terms were unconstitutional for crimes committed as minors. Courts reviewed the cases multiple times, but each attempt to overturn the sentence failed. The evidence was too strong, the brutality too great. Still, the legal challenges kept Cassie's family trapped in the cycle of reliving the nightmare. Her relatives spoke publicly about the pain of reopening wounds each time an appeal was filed. Cassie's mother once said, "They took her from us once. Every time they appeal, they take her again." Inside prison, both Brian and Tori began to take different paths. Brian Draper eventually admitted full responsibility, claiming to have found religion and expressing remorse for his actions. Tori Adamczyk, however, continued to deny his involvement for years, insisting that the tapes were exaggerated performances. But for Cassie's family, remorse came too late, and denial changed nothing. They visited her grave often, leaving flowers, letters, and small trinkets, tokens of a life stolen too soon. Outside the courtroom, Cassie's murder became a subject of documentaries, crime shows, and psychological studies. People across the country were drawn to the case because of how ordinary it seemed. Two average boys from a small town deciding to kill for fame and thrill. It forced communities everywhere to confront uncomfortable questions. How could teenage fascination with violence evolve into real murder? How could no one have seen the warning signs? Teachers recalled the boys' interest in dark films and writings, but no one thought it was dangerous. To many experts, it became a textbook case of moral disengagement, the process by which individuals separate their actions from empathy, turning people into objects and violence into spectacle. Cassie's story continues to echo in classrooms and true crime discussions today. Schools use her case as a reminder to recognize troubling behavior, to speak up when someone crosses lines between fascination and obsession. Her name stands as a symbol of innocence destroyed by senseless evil, and of how easily fiction can bleed into reality when morality disappears. Each anniversary of her death brings renewed reflection in Pocatello. Friends gather at her memorial, remembering her smile, her kindness, and her dreams. All the things that were taken from her that September night. For those who knew her, Cassie is not remembered as a victim of horror, but as a young woman full of promise and heart. Her teachers recall how she loved art, how she always volunteered to help others. Her classmates still describe her as gentle and humble. Even those who barely knew her say her story changed the way they looked at the world, how they became more cautious, more aware of the darkness that can hide behind friendly faces. In the end, Cassie Jo Stoddart's murder left scars that would never fully heal. It was a crime that defied explanation, one born not from hatred, revenge, or jealousy, but from pure, empty cruelty. Brian Draper and Tori Adamczyk sought infamy and ended up as prisoners of their own monstrous fantasy. They became what they wanted to imitate, the villains in a horror story. But unlike the movies they loved, there was no special effects team, no reset button, and no second take. There was only reality, and a young life that would never be lived again. As years pass, the story remains a warning, not just about violence, but about the danger of losing empathy, of letting imagination become obsession. Cassie's memory lives on through those who loved her, through awareness programs and documentaries that tell her story with respect and sorrow. She was not a character in their film. She was a daughter, a friend, a student, and her life, though short, became a voice that still speaks against senseless cruelty. In the quiet streets of Pocatello, people still remember her name, whispered like a prayer. Cassie Jo Stoddart, forever 16. Two best friends, a weekend getaway, and one fatal mistake. What began as harmless laughter between mates ended in tragedy that would haunt a lifetime. In this shocking true story from coastal Australia, discover how a simple play fight spiraled into death, guilt, and an unthinkable search for forgiveness. The weekend had begun like any other road trip among friends. A mixture of laughter, loud music, and the promise of carefree days ahead. Along the winding highways stretching from South Australia toward Victoria's southern coastline, a small group of young tradesmen drove in convoy, their cars packed with surfboards, beer cartons, and the kind of unrestrained excitement that only youth can hold. Among them was 21-year-old Quinn McPherson, a hard-working trot-eye known for his easy smile and restless energy. Riding with him was his best friend, Alex Robinson, also in his early 20s, equally spirited, equally reckless, and bound to Quinn by years of shared mischief and loyalty. Their friendship was the kind that felt indestructible, built through endless shifts on dusty work sites, long pub nights, and stories told under the stars after too many drinks. The plan was simple. A short getaway in a rented coastal house near the edge of Victoria, surrounded by cliffs, ocean breeze, and the illusion of freedom from responsibility. Quinn had booked the place himself, a modest beach rental with a weathered deck overlooking the waves. The group, 5 friends in total, arrived late in the afternoon, tired but giddy. The first beers cracked open before the bags were even unpacked. Someone put music on a portable speaker, and soon laughter filled the air. These were young men chasing a pause in their lives, unaware that by the end of the weekend, everything would be undone by a single irreversible mistake. As night fell, the tone shifted from relaxed to rowdy. The drinks kept flowing. Bottles clinked, joints were passed around, and someone suggested playing drinking games. Quinn, who had always been competitive, teased Alex about who could handle more. They had always challenged each other, arm wrestling at bars, racing to finish beers, sparring playfully in parking lots. Their friends were used to it. "It's just how they are," one would later tell police. "They're like brothers who can't stop proving who's tougher." By 10 p.m., the house was buzzing with drunken noise and the low hum of poor decisions. The floor was littered with bottles, and the ocean breeze carried the scent of salt and smoke through the open doors. At one point, someone filmed a short clip on their phone. Quinn and Alex laughing, arms slung around each other, talking nonsense to the camera. It was supposed to be another night they'd forget by morning. Instead, it became one of the last moments they'd ever share as friends. When the play fight began, no one took it seriously. Quinn and Alex had started pushing each other around, pretending to box, fueled by alcohol and bravado. "Come on, show me what you've got," Alex joked, squaring his shoulders. Laughter echoed around the room. Quinn lunged forward, wrapping his arm around Alex's neck in a loose chokehold, the kind you'd see in a wrestling video or at a gym demonstration. First, it was all in good fun. Alex struggled, trying to break free, laughing breathlessly. But seconds passed, and Quinn didn't let go. Those nearby thought it was still a joke. "He's fine," someone said, watching from the couch. But Alex's laughter turned to gasps. His arms flailed, then dropped. In the blur of alcohol and noise, no one realized how quickly things had changed. The pressure on his neck restricted oxygen, cutting blood flow to his brain. Quinn thought he was just making Alex tap out, that his friend would jump up laughing, same as always. Instead, Alex went limp. The laughter died. Silence took over. Quinn released his grip and stepped back, expecting Alex to move. He didn't. His head slumped to the side, eyes half open, lips pale. "Oi, Alex," Quinn said, shaking him lightly. There was no response. The others rushed forward, panic rising. Someone shouted for water. Someone else screamed for an ambulance. They laid Alex on the floor, trying to wake him. His chest wasn't moving. Quinn's hands trembled as he pressed down, starting CPR the way he remembered from a workplace safety course. Between compressions, he whispered his friend's name, begging him to wake up. When the paramedics arrived minutes later, chaos filled the small house. Flashing blue lights painted the walls. Quinn stood drenched in sweat, face streaked with tears, as medics worked frantically over Alex's still body. His friends huddled near the doorway, their voices shaking, each replaying the moment over and over, wishing someone had intervened sooner. But it was too late. After nearly half an hour of resuscitation attempts, Alex Robinson was declared dead at the scene. Quinn collapsed when he heard the words. Witnesses would later say he screamed, clutching his head, repeating, "I didn't mean to. I didn't mean to." The police arrived soon after, taking statements, photographing the scene, and leading Quinn outside. He sat on the curb, staring at the horizon, his hands shaking uncontrollably. The weight of what had happened hadn't fully hit him yet. Only hours before, his best friend had been laughing beside him. Now he was gone. Back at the station, the questions began. Quinn explained what happened, his voice hoarse, his words tumbling between sobs. He didn't deny anything. He told them about the drinking, the play fight, the chokehold, how it was never meant to hurt anyone. The detectives listened carefully, marking down every detail. They didn't sense malice, but the law had to follow its course. The coroner's report would later confirm that Alex had died from lack of oxygen caused by neck compression. A tragic accident, but one rooted in recklessness. News of the death spread quickly through their hometowns in South Australia. The two men were well known in their community. Hardworking, friendly, always together. Social media filled with tributes for Alex. Photos of him smiling at job sites, camping trips, and birthdays. Beneath every post were comments expressing disbelief. "They were like brothers," one friend wrote. "I can't believe something like this could happen between them." As Quinn waited for the legal process to unfold, he withdrew from everyone. He barely spoke, spending most days in silence. Those who visited him said he looked hollowed out, consumed by guilt that words couldn't describe. "He loved Alex like family," one of the group later said. "He'll never forgive himself, no matter what the court decides." The case that began as a night of friendship turned fatal would soon enter the courtroom, testing not only the limits of the law but the depths of human remorse. What had started as laughter on a summer night would become a haunting reminder that sometimes the smallest choices, a gesture, a moment of thoughtlessness, can change everything forever. The morning after the tragedy was heavy and unreal, as if the air itself had thickened with grief. The holiday rental, once filled with music and laughter, now stood silent except for the low murmur of police radios and the sound of waves crashing in the distance. Quinn McPherson sat outside on the front steps, wrapped in a gray blanket, staring blankly at the sand-streaked driveway. His hands were still trembling, his mind frozen in that moment when he'd realized his best friend wasn't breathing. Behind him, inside the house, investigators moved methodically through each room, photographing beer bottles, collecting fingerprints, and measuring distances as though they were piecing together a crime scene rather than a night of innocent fun turned fatal. The detectives treated it as they would any unexpected death. They interviewed the friends one by one, asking for every detail: what they had been drinking, who started the fight, how long the chokehold lasted. Each of them told the same story. It had been a joke, a harmless bit of play fighting between two mates who'd done it 100 times before. But this time something went wrong. "He didn't mean to hurt him," one said through tears. "He was just mucking around." Their voices cracked with guilt. But it was Quinn who seemed completely broken, lost in a haze of disbelief and self-blame. When the police finally placed a hand on his shoulder and told him he would need to come to the station, he didn't resist. He simply nodded. In the car ride there, he sat in silence, replaying every second of that night. The sound of Alex laughing, the pressure of his arm around his friend's neck, the way his body suddenly went limp. His chest tightened with each memory. He kept whispering, almost to himself, "If I'd just let go sooner." At the station, the formalities began. They took his fingerprints, photographed his face, and read him his rights. The words manslaughter and reckless endangerment echoed through the room. But Quinn barely understood them. He didn't think of it as a crime. He thought of it as a nightmare, one he couldn't wake from. When questioned, he was honest about everything: the drinking, the drugs, the chokehold, and the panic that followed. His candor impressed the officers, but it didn't change the reality that a man was dead. The law demanded accountability. Meanwhile, Alex Robinson's family was notified. His parents received the call early that morning. The news shattered them. Their son, full of life, humor, and kindness, was gone. When they were told it had happened during a play fight with a friend, their grief turned to confusion. How could something so childish, so senseless, take their son's life? In the days that followed, they traveled to Victoria to identify the body. Reporters had already caught wind of the story: "Young man dies in Holiday House tragedy," and local newspapers printed photos of Alex, smiling and carefree, beside grim headlines. The small coastal town where it happened was unsettled by the news. Locals spoke in hushed tones at cafes and petrol stations, calling it a terrible accident. But in the age of social media, judgment spread faster than facts. Online, comments filled with speculation appeared under every post. Some called for justice, others defended Quinn, insisting he wasn't a killer. It became a digital tug-of-war between outrage and empathy. Through it all, Quinn remained hidden away, forbidden from contacting the Robinson family, though he desperately wanted to. The toxicology results came back within weeks. Both men had high levels of alcohol and traces of drugs in their systems. The substances, combined with physical exertion, had made Alex's body more vulnerable to the effects of the chokehold. The coroner's report described the cause of death as asphyxia due to neck compression. It was the clinical confirmation of what everyone already knew. It hadn't been a fight, but a moment of reckless physicality gone fatally wrong. Prosecutors reviewed the evidence carefully. They debated whether to pursue a manslaughter charge or something lesser. Ultimately, they decided to charge Quinn McPherson with manslaughter, citing that his actions, though unintentional, directly caused the death of another person. The news hit Quinn like a second blow. He didn't deny responsibility, but he couldn't reconcile the word manslaughter with who he was. He had never been violent. He had never even been in a real fight. His friends described him as the guy who diffused conflict, not caused it. Yet here he was, facing the kind of charge that carried years in prison. Months passed as the legal process unfolded. Quinn's lawyer, appointed through a public defender, began working to have the charge reduced. He argued that the incident was not an act of aggression but a tragic accident. The chokehold, he explained, had been applied without understanding its danger. Expert witnesses were brought in to discuss how quickly oxygen deprivation can cause unconsciousness, sometimes in less than 10 seconds. The prosecution didn't dispute the lack of intent but emphasized that recklessness was still punishable. A young man's life had ended because of another's poor judgment, they said, and that could not go unpunished. When the preliminary hearing began, the courtroom was filled with quiet tension. The Robinson family sat together in the front row, faces drawn, holding photos of their son. Quinn sat at the defense table, head lowered, his hands clasped tightly together. He looked nothing like the carefree young man from the holiday photos now shown in court. His shoulders slumped, his eyes hollow, as if every breath was an apology. When asked to stand and enter a plea, his voice cracked, not guilty to manslaughter, but guilty to reckless conduct endangering life. The plea was part of a negotiated agreement, one that recognized the absence of intent while acknowledging the danger of his actions. The judge accepted the plea and scheduled sentencing. Over the following weeks, character references poured in, from employers, friends, even former teachers, describing Quinn as kind, hardworking, and deeply remorseful. Several letters from the Robinson family were also submitted. Though they were devastated, they expressed a level of compassion that stunned even the court. "We know Quinn didn't mean to hurt Alex," one letter read. "We don't want to see another young life destroyed because of this tragedy." It was a statement of forgiveness that few could have imagined, born from unbearable loss and an understanding that grief cannot always demand vengeance. During sentencing, the judge's words echoed through the courtroom with solemn weight. He described the case as a heartbreaking example of how easily recklessness can turn deadly. He acknowledged Quinn's cooperation, his youth, and the sincerity of his remorse. "You will live with this for the rest of your life," he said softly. "No punishment this court can impose will equal the burden you already carry." With that, he sentenced Quinn McPherson to a community corrections order, no prison time but mandatory counseling, supervision, and service to the community. When Quinn left the courthouse that day, reporters surrounded him, shouting questions. He didn't answer. His eyes were fixed on the ground, his face pale and unreadable. Behind him, the Robinsons walked silently, their grief etched into every step. The verdict didn't feel like victory for anyone. It wasn't supposed to. There was no justice that could bring back Alex Robinson, no sentence that could erase that night. The story had no villains, only victims of a single moment's thoughtlessness that changed two families forever. Outside, the coastal wind was sharp and cold. Quinn paused for a moment on the courthouse steps, his mother's hand gripping his arm. Cameras flashed, but he didn't notice. All he could see was Alex's face, smiling, alive, the way he had been before everything went wrong. The months following the court's decision moved slowly, as if time itself resisted returning to normal. For Quinn McPherson, life after the verdict was not freedom in any meaningful sense. It was a suspended existence, haunted by memory, guilt, and the irreversible weight of what had happened. He returned to South Australia quietly, away from cameras and headlines, to rebuild what was left of his life. The conditions of his community corrections order were clear. He was to attend regular counseling, complete community service, and maintain steady employment. But these requirements were the least of his burdens. The real sentence was invisible. The constant replaying of that night, the choking silence that followed, and the knowledge that his best friend would never grow older while he continued to breathe. In the small town where they had both grown up, whispers lingered. Some saw Quinn as a tragic figure, a boy who made a fatal mistake and would spend the rest of his life paying for it. Others, less forgiving, saw him as reckless, careless, a symbol of youth gone astray. He avoided the pubs where they used to hang out, stopped attending local football games, and rarely spoke to anyone outside his immediate family. Even casual encounters were heavy with unspoken judgment. People meant well, offering quiet condolences, but every gesture reminded him of the one person he could never apologize to. Counseling sessions became the only space where Quinn spoke openly. His counselor described him as deeply remorseful, unable to move past the if-only moments. "If only we hadn't drunk so much," he would say. "If only I'd let go sooner." His nights were the hardest. Sleep came in fragments, often broken by flashes of memory. Alex laughing, struggling, then going still. Sometimes he heard his name in the dark, the echo of a friendship that had once felt unbreakable. The guilt was suffocating, but the counseling helped him begin to understand that what had happened, while tragic, was not born of cruelty. It was the product of youth, alcohol, and one terrible decision in a moment that should have meant nothing. Meanwhile, Alex Robinson's family tried to navigate life after loss. Their home, once full of their son's voice, had grown quiet. His room remained untouched for months. Clothes folded neatly, posters still pinned to the wall, a photograph of him and Quinn smiling on a fishing trip framed beside his bed. His mother couldn't bring herself to remove it, even after everything. "That was the real them," she said in a later interview. Two boys who loved each other like brothers. Despite their grief, the Robinsons had chosen compassion over anger. They understood that nothing could undo what had happened, and punishing Quinn further would not heal their pain. They attended every community forum that addressed youth substance abuse and recklessness, speaking about the importance of understanding consequences before it's too late. Their story became a quiet warning, not shouted in outrage, but told in the trembling voices of parents who had lost everything. In the broader community, the case sparked reflection. News outlets and local programs discussed the dangers of so-called play fights, how easily they could turn deadly. Medical experts appeared on talk shows explaining that chokeholds, even when performed lightly, can restrict blood flow to the brain in seconds. It became a tragic example used in awareness campaigns about alcohol and risk behavior. For a while, Quinn's name circulated in the media, though often without malice. He wasn't portrayed as a villain, but as a symbol of how fragile life can be when carelessness meets intoxication. Still, every article reopened wounds. Each time his name appeared, he felt Alex's absence more sharply, as if the world refused to let him forget. Not that he ever could. By the first anniversary of Alex's death, the two families had cautiously begun to reconnect. It started with a letter. Quinn wrote to Alex's parents through his lawyer, apologizing for everything. Not in legal terms, but in human ones. The letter was simple, handwritten, raw with regret. "I wish I could change places with him," he wrote. "I think about him every day. I know sorry will never be enough, but it's all I have left." Weeks later, he received a reply. It was short but kind. "We know you didn't mean to hurt our son," it read. "We hope you find a way to forgive yourself, because Alex would have wanted that." The exchange didn't erase the past, but it opened a fragile bridge between them. A silent understanding that forgiveness, though painful, was possible. That same year, Quinn began volunteering through his community service order. He worked with a youth outreach program that spoke at schools about alcohol, peer pressure, and consequence. The first time he stood before a group of teenagers, his voice shook. He told them about the night that changed his life, about how a simple joke between friends could turn deadly in seconds. The students listened in silence, some wiping tears from their eyes. For many of them, it was the first time they'd heard such honesty from someone their own age who had lived through the unthinkable. For Quinn, those talks became a kind of therapy, a way to give meaning to a senseless tragedy, to make sure Alex's death wasn't just another headline lost to time. But the guilt never left completely. On quiet evenings, Quinn would drive to the coast. Not the same beach from that weekend, but another, quieter stretch of shoreline. He'd sit by the water for hours, watching the tide move in and out. Sometimes he'd talk out loud, as if Alex were still there beside him, telling him about work, about how things were getting better, about how sorry he still was. The waves never answered, but somehow, sitting there, he found a sliver of peace. Years later, when the story was revisited in a small documentary series about accidental deaths among young Australians, both families agreed to participate. They spoke not to sensationalize, but to humanize. The documentary showed footage of their hometown, the old photos of the boys together, and the court sketches from that somber day. Quinn appeared too, older, quieter, his voice steady but heavy with reflection. "People think punishment ends when the court does," he said on camera. "But for me, it never ends. Every day I carry it. Every time I smile, I think of him. Every good moment feels like something I stole. His words lingered long after the screen faded to black. The story of Quinn McPherson and Alex Robinson became more than just a case file or a headline. It became a mirror held up to youth, a lesson etched in grief, showing how easily laughter can turn to tragedy, how the smallest choices can unravel lives. There were no villains in this story, only two friends bound by fate and undone by a single, fatal mistake. In the end, what remained was not blame, but the fragile grace of forgiveness, the understanding that tragedy can coexist with compassion, and that sometimes survival itself becomes the hardest punishment of all. Two best friends. One camera. One gun. What began as a harmless photo turned into a fatal mistake that would change lives forever. This is the haunting true story of friendship, recklessness, and regret. A single moment that turned laughter into tragedy and left Melbourne asking, how could this happen? The night began like so many others, carefree, loud, and full of the easy laughter that comes from youth unburdened by consequence. It was late in 2015, in the northern outskirts of Melbourne, when a group of friends gathered at a modest roadside motel to celebrate nothing in particular. There was no grand occasion, no reason to remember the night except for the company they kept, until everything changed in the blink of an eye. The cheap room was cluttered with takeaway wrappers, music hummed from a phone speaker, and the air was thick with cigarette smoke. Among the small group were two young men, best friends by every definition that mattered, Albert Rapovsky and Mehmed Hassan, both just 20 years old. Albert was the kind of friend everyone liked to have around. Energetic, always cracking jokes, always trying to impress. Beneath that charm, though, was a restlessness, a hunger to seem tougher than he really was. Growing up in Melbourne's northern suburbs hadn't been easy. The neighborhoods were stitched together with a mix of immigrant families and working-class kids trying to find their place in a world that often judged them before they spoke. For Albert, image mattered, the way people looked at you, the confidence in your walk, the danger you carried in your silence. He wasn't a criminal, not really, but he liked the idea of being feared, of being someone people wouldn't mess with. It was that illusion of toughness that would become the shadow leading him toward the worst mistake of his life. Mehmed Hassan was different. He had come to Australia from East Africa with his family years earlier, chasing the promise of safety and opportunity. Those who knew him said he was warm, humble, and loyal to a fault. His smile had a way of disarming people, and he was the kind of friend who made everyone feel included. While he enjoyed the same music, clothes, and fast lifestyle that young men like Albert admired, his heart wasn't hardened by it. He laughed easily, dreamed quietly, and wanted simple things, to help his parents, to travel, maybe to open a business one day. Albert and Mehmed's friendship was one of those bonds that didn't need explanation. They had grown close through school and neighborhood life, sharing long nights of banter, videos, and adventures. That night at the motel, the mood was reckless but harmless at first. A few drinks went around, jokes were cracked, music blasted from tinny speakers, and someone suggested taking pictures. Phones came out, and with them the familiar ritual of posing, pretending, and capturing moments that would later flood social media. It was a time when young men idolized street culture, photos with cars, cash, and sometimes weapons. It wasn't real danger. It was theater, a performance for likes and approval. When Albert pulled out the sawn-off shotgun, it didn't immediately strike anyone as alarming. The weapon was old, ugly, and small enough to hide easily. Nobody asked where it came from. Nobody thought it was loaded. Albert held it casually, grinning for the camera as Mehmed laughed beside him. "Make it look real," Mehmed joked, raising his phone to frame the shot. The others laughed. Albert lifted the shotgun, pointing it toward his friend in a half-serious, half-playful pose, the kind of thing young men do when they believe they're invincible. He didn't mean harm. He didn't even think. The moment stretched thin between laughter and the sudden, deafening blast that followed. The sound was brutal, a sharp thunder that cracked the room in two. The music stopped, screams erupted, and the smell of gunpowder filled the air. Mehmed fell backward instantly, his body collapsing before anyone could process what had happened. Albert froze, staring in disbelief at the smoke curling from the barrel. Then came the panic, the realization that what was meant to be a joke, a photo, a moment of fun, had become something irreversible. He dropped the weapon, rushing to his friend's side, shaking him, calling his name over and over. But there was no response. The laughter was gone. The room had turned cold, the walls echoing with cries and confusion. One of the friends stumbled outside, screaming for help, while another fumbled with his phone, dialing emergency services. Albert knelt beside Mohammed, his hands shaking, blood on his clothes, whispering through tears that he didn't mean it. Witnesses would later say his cries were unbearable, raw, desperate, and filled with a horror no punishment could ever erase. When the police arrived, the scene told its own story. The sawn-off shotgun lay abandoned on the carpet. Mohammed's phone was still on the floor, the camera app open, frozen on the last frame it had captured before the shot. Officers moved quickly, separating the witnesses, securing the weapon, and placing Albert in handcuffs. He didn't resist. He couldn't. His face was blank, drained of everything except disbelief. When questioned, he admitted it immediately. "It went off. I didn't know it was loaded." Those words, simple and hollow, would follow him through every courtroom, every newspaper, every sleepless night that lay ahead. As forensic teams worked through the early hours of the morning, detectives pieced together the fragments of what had happened. The weapon they discovered had been illegally modified, its barrel sawed short, its trigger dangerously light. It had no place in the hands of anyone, let alone a group of young men playing pretend in a motel room. The investigation also revealed that Albert had shown off the gun before. Friends recalled seeing him handle it, pose with it, even brag about it once or twice, though they all assumed it was never functional. That assumption had cost a life. Back at the police station, Albert sat in silence, staring at the floor. He asked if Mohammed was okay, though deep down he already knew the answer. When they told him his best friend was gone, he broke, sobbing, shaking, unable to comprehend that one careless moment had ended a life and destroyed his own. In the days that followed, news of the shooting spread quickly across Melbourne. The headline was everywhere: "Man killed by friend during photo with shotgun." For the public, it was another senseless tragedy. Young men, guns, and recklessness. But for two families, it was a nightmare without end. Mohammed's family was shattered. His parents, who had fled hardship to build a safer life in Australia, couldn't understand how something so pointless could take their son. Community members gathered to mourn, to pray, and to demand change. Meanwhile, Albert's family faced their own kind of torment. They grieved too for the victim, but also for the boy they had raised, who now faced prison for a mistake that would haunt him forever. The justice system moved swiftly. Albert was charged with manslaughter, the prosecution acknowledging there was no intent to kill but arguing that his behavior had been reckless, dangerous, and unlawful. As the legal process began, so did the long, painful reckoning. In a matter of seconds, two young men who once shared laughter, loyalty, and brotherhood had been torn apart. One buried, one behind bars. And as Melbourne read about the case, the question lingered in every mind. How could something meant to look real become so fatally real? The weeks after the shooting were heavy with silence. Melbourne's northern suburbs, usually alive with chatter, felt muted, subdued. Among the Somali-Australian community that Mohammed Hassan called home, grief hung like a cloud. His funeral drew hundreds, friends, family, and strangers who came to mourn a life lost to carelessness. The mosque filled with quiet sobs and whispered prayers as his mother clung to her husband's arm, barely able to stand. The sound of her crying echoed through the courtyard, the kind of pain that breaks through even the hardest hearts. For many, this tragedy was more than an accident. It was a symbol of everything that frightened parents about raising their sons in a world where danger was often mistaken for strength. In those early days, as the police investigation continued, details began to emerge that painted a clearer picture of what had happened. Detectives confirmed that the sawn-off shotgun was illegal, crudely modified, and missing its serial number. The weapon had changed hands multiple times before ending up in the motel that night. They traced it back through whispers, favors, and street exchanges. A gun that was never meant to exist, let alone be treated as a toy. The prosecution built its case around this fact. It wasn't murder, that was clear from the start. There had been no argument, no intention, no malice. But what could not be ignored was the recklessness that had brought the gun into that room and the fatal ignorance that pulled the trigger. For Albert Rapovsky, those first weeks in custody were a blur. The shock hadn't worn off. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Maham's face. Laughing one second, lifeless the next. Prison officers described him as quiet and withdrawn, spending hours staring at the floor of his cell. His lawyers advised him to remain calm, to cooperate, to accept responsibility. But how do you accept something you can't forgive yourself for? He didn't fight the charges. From the very beginning, he admitted guilt. The words, "I didn't mean it," had turned into a mantra, repeated through tears during every interview, every court hearing, every sleepless night. The court hearings began months later. Cameras waited outside, capturing the young man in handcuffs, head bowed, as he was led inside the county court of Victoria. The public watched the case unfold with a mixture of pity and anger. Some saw Albert as a foolish kid who made a deadly mistake. Others saw him as a reckless man who treated a lethal weapon like a prop. Both were true. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was tense but calm. The judge listened carefully as the prosecution laid out its version of events. A night of drinking and laughter that spiraled into tragedy because of one unlawful decision. Prosecutors described Albert's fascination with street bravado, how he and his friends posed for photos with weapons, cars, and cash. They spoke of the gun, the illegal sawn-off shotgun that had no safety, the kind of weapon used in robberies, not photos. They didn't paint him as evil but as dangerously naive. The courtroom was still when the police photos were shown. The motel room littered with bottles, the weapon lying on the carpet, the blood-stained floor, and the phone on the bed showing the half-taken picture. For a moment, even Albert couldn't look. His head dropped, hands trembling as the images confirmed the nightmare was real. When it was the defense's turn, Albert's lawyer spoke softly, describing his client as a young man with no history of violence, no criminal intent, and deep remorse. He had turned himself in, told the truth, and broken down in police custody. His life, the lawyer said, was not that of a killer but of someone who made one catastrophic mistake. Letters of support were read aloud, from family members, childhood friends, even his employer. They described a kind boy, someone who helped others, who had a big heart. But no letter, no plea, could undo what happened. The defense didn't ask for sympathy. They asked for understanding. Then came the victim impact statements. Maham's family spoke through tears. His father's voice cracked as he described his son, a boy full of laughter and promise. He spoke of the moment he got the call, the disbelief, the feeling of the world collapsing. "He was my only son," he said softly. "We left everything behind for safety, and now safety took him." His mother couldn't speak at all. A statement was read on her behalf, describing sleepless nights, grief that filled every corner of their home, and the unbearable image of her child dying in a room where he thought he was among friends. For the first time during the trial, Albert looked up, meeting the eyes of Maham's family. Tears streamed down his face. He wanted to say something, anything, but the words wouldn't come. When he was invited to speak before sentencing, he did. His voice was shaking, barely audible. "I loved him," he said. "He was my brother. I will never forgive myself. I wish it was me instead." The courtroom fell silent. Even the judge paused for a moment before continuing. The judge's words were measured, calm, and heavy with purpose. He acknowledged that Albert hadn't intended to kill anyone, that the act was indeed accidental. But, he said, accidents born of illegality are not accidents at all. They are preventable. The sawn-off shotgun was illegal, its use reckless, its handling criminally negligent. The judge called the death of Mahamd Hassan a tragedy of utter stupidity, one that could have been avoided by a single moment of thought. He noted Albert's genuine remorse but also emphasized the need for justice, not just for punishment but as a warning. In the courtroom that day, as the sentence was read, 9 years in prison with a non-parole period of 6. There was no celebration, no closure. Maham's family wept quietly, and Albert's mother collapsed in tears. Everyone had lost something. The judge ended with a line that stayed with those present. A moment of bravado cost a young man his life and another his freedom. There are no winners here, only lessons written in grief. As Albert was led away, he turned once, glancing at the Hassan family. It wasn't a look for forgiveness. It was a look of recognition, of understanding that nothing he could ever say would be enough. Reporters outside captured the headlines, but inside, what lingered was silence. The courtroom emptied slowly, each person leaving behind the echo of a story that felt painfully avoidable. In the days following the sentencing, opinion pieces appeared in newspapers and talk shows debated youth culture and guns. How had it come to this? Why did young people treat weapons like accessories? There were calls for tighter laws, for community education, for conversations about masculinity and identity. Parents spoke to their sons about caution, about respect, about how easily a moment of play could turn deadly. The story of Maham and Albert became a cautionary tale, retold in classrooms, news features, and police campaigns. A haunting reminder of what happens when a second of stupidity collides with irreversible consequence. For Albert, prison life was a daily reminder of the life he'd taken. He avoided trouble, kept to himself, and worked quietly in the prison workshop. Inmates described him as polite, almost invisible. The guilt weighed heavier than any sentence. Each day began and ended with the same thought. If only he hadn't picked up that gun. And somewhere outside those walls, in a quiet Melbourne neighborhood, a mother lit a candle every evening for her son, whispering prayers for the boy she'd lost, and perhaps, for the boy who had taken him too. Years passed slowly behind the gray walls of the prison that became Albert Rapovsky's world. Time moved differently there, not in hours or days, but in the weight of reflection. Each night, he lay on his narrow bunk, staring at the ceiling, replaying the same few seconds over and over. Maham's laughter, the flash of the camera, the deafening crack that ended everything. Inmates came and went, but Albert stayed quiet, working in the laundry, keeping to himself. The guards said he was one of the few who never caused trouble. He never raised his voice, never joined in fights, never blamed anyone else. He was serving more than a sentence. He was living with the echo of his own actions. Prison can harden people, but it broke Albert in a different way. The first year was numbness, the second was realization, and the third was sorrow. He wrote letters to Maham's family that were never sent, filled with apologies that no one asked for. He attended counseling sessions, sometimes speaking, often silent. Other inmates talked about their crimes with pride or regret, but Albert didn't see himself as one of them. He hadn't set out to harm anyone, yet the guilt he carried was heavier than most murderers. There were nights when he woke up shaking, hearing the gunshot in his dreams. The psychologists told him it was trauma, but he called it punishment. Outside, the story had faded from headlines but not from memory. In the community where both young men had grown up, people still spoke of the tragedy as a warning. It became part of local lore, the story of two friends, a camera, and a gun. Schools used it in talks about youth responsibility and firearm safety. Mothers brought up their sons with caution, reminding them of how fragile life could be. For the Hassan family, however, no public campaign could ease the pain. Maham's room remained untouched for years, his clothes folded neatly, his photos smiling from the shelves. His mother often said she could still hear his footsteps, his laughter, the sound of his key turning in the door. Time did what time always does. It dulled the edges of pain but never erased it. 6 years after the sentencing, Albert became eligible for parole. The hearing was quiet, attended by few. He had completed every rehabilitation program, shown good behavior, and expressed remorse consistently. His lawyer argued that he had paid his debt to society, that his youth at the time of the crime and his genuine sorrow warranted a second chance. The parole board reviewed his record, his psychological evaluations, and letters from prison staff describing him as a young man deeply changed by tragedy. After careful deliberation, They granted parole under strict conditions. When he walked out of the prison gates, Albert was 26, older, thinner, and haunted. Freedom didn't feel like freedom. It felt like another form of confinement. The world had moved on without him. The city felt faster, louder, unfamiliar. Friends he once knew had disappeared, building their own lives far from the shadow of his mistake. He found temporary work through a rehabilitation program, cleaning warehouses and painting walls. He didn't complain. Every day was an act of quiet repentance, a chance to live in a way that honored the life he had taken. But guilt is not something that fades. He often avoided mirrors because he couldn't stand the man staring back. He never touched alcohol again, never posed for photos, never allowed himself to forget. Sometimes he would walk through the same neighborhoods he and Mohammed once roamed. The corner shop where they bought snacks, the park where they played soccer, the bus stop where they used to laugh about nothing. Each place was a memory, frozen in time. On certain nights, he would stand outside the mosque during prayers, listening from a distance, never daring to enter. One evening, months after his release, Albert made a quiet decision to visit Mohammed's family. It was something he had feared for years, but also something he knew he owed them. He arrived unannounced, holding a single white flower. When the door opened, the moment was heavy with silence. Mohammed's father stood there, older and grayer than before, his expression unreadable. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then Albert said softly, "I came to say sorry, not for the court, not for myself, but for him." His voice trembled as he continued, "There isn't a day I don't see his face. I wish I could change it. I can't." The old man looked at him for what felt like an eternity. Then quietly he nodded. "You took my son," he said, "but I believe you carry him every day. That is your punishment, and maybe also your forgiveness." He took the flower and closed the door gently, leaving Albert standing there in the dusk. There was no embrace, no absolution, just a quiet recognition that two lives, one lost, one broken, would forever be bound by a single moment. In the years that followed, Albert lived simply. He volunteered with community organizations that worked to steer young people away from crime and gun violence. He never told them his full story, but he didn't need to. The pain in his voice when he spoke about choices and consequences said enough. "A second of stupidity can take everything from you," he would tell them. "Don't chase an image that isn't real." The young ones listened, some out of respect, some out of fear, and many later said his words stayed with them. Meanwhile, Mohammed's name continued to be honored. His community started a small youth fund in his memory, scholarships for students pursuing photography and media, the very passions that had brought him joy. His friends organized yearly gatherings to remember him, not in sadness but in laughter, sharing stories of the boy who could make anyone smile. For his family, the pain never left, but it transformed. They chose to remember him for his kindness, not his death. Documentary filmmakers would later recount the story, not as a tale of crime, but as a warning about carelessness, masculinity, and the illusion of power. The reenactments showed two friends smiling for a camera, unaware that they were capturing the final seconds of their youth. Experts discussed the psychology of risk-taking, the influence of social image, and the tragedy of a generation trying to look fearless while being fragile underneath. It was haunting because it was ordinary, a night like any other, destroyed by one fatal mistake. By the time Albert turned 30, he had rebuilt a fragile version of life. He worked quietly, avoided publicity, and found comfort in solitude. He spoke occasionally at community events, always ending with the same sentence: "If I could trade my freedom for his life, I would." Those who met him described him as gentle, remorseful, and forever marked by grief. He never sought forgiveness in the traditional sense. Instead, he lived every day as an act of penance. The story of Albert Rapovsky and Mohammed Hassan remains one of Australia's most heartbreaking examples of how recklessness can destroy everything in a single instant. Two best friends, bonded by laughter and youth, were torn apart by one pull of a trigger. No villain, no plan, just a tragic collision of immaturity, pride, and fate. Years later, as people look back, the message remains painfully clear. Sometimes the most dangerous weapon isn't the gun itself, but the moment we forget how real it is.